Welcome to the Project Management for Technology video series. This goes along with Chapter 7 and it's entitled Risk. I'm James Reneau Ph.D. at Shawnee State University and I'll be taking you through this presentation. In this presentation, we're going to define what is risk. We're going to identify risks. We're going to do some risk analysis. We're going to discuss how we're going to respond to risk. And we're going to show some a technique for how we monitor risks within a project. Let's start our discussion by defining what is risk. According to Heldman in her book on project management, she says a risk is a potential future event that can have either negative or positive impacts on the project. Risk is unknown. Risk is not certain. Risk is a potential. Um, Something that most people don't think about, though, when they think about risk is risks can be good or they can be bad. For instance, there's a risk that the price of a product you're using would go down. There's a chance. There's a chance it could increase also. So there are risks both to the positive and negative, and we've got to manage both types. Think of all the risks you take every day. Driving. People have automobile accidents. There are people killed in their cars on a pretty regular basis. It's a risky endeavor. Walking down the street, eating, is a risk because there are foodborne illnesses and allergies and all kinds of things that could cause problems when you even eat. But those are risks that we accept and we just deal with. There are so in your project, there are all kinds of everyday risks that also are a potential to happen during the life of your project. It's interesting to think that some people seek out risk, that do the adventure sports, jump out of airplanes with parachutes, or bungee jump, or whitewater raft, or spelunk and cave, and take all kinds of risks. And there are others that are very risk averse that just sit in their recliner or sit in their armchair. But even they are taking risks because a tornado could come, or this could come, or lightning strike, or I mean, good grief, just about anything could happen. So there are some project managers and some project sponsors that embrace risk and are really cool with it and want you to be a little riskier. And there are others that you're going to work with over and employees and others you're going to work with that are much more risk averse and much more don't seek out that kind of risk. So we've defined what risks are. Now let's identify risks. And one of the things that you as a project manager, and really you in any business situation, need to do is determine and document the risks. Here are some sample risks: funding risks, schedule risks, scope risks. Maybe you don't have the scope well defined. A change requirement risk. Well, that's a risk that the client is going to say, well, we need to change the requirements. That's something good, something bad. Vendor risk. Maybe you've got a supplier that goes out of business or goes back stock or goes something. You've got hardware risks of when you're dealing with pieces of equipment, either a piece of equipment or computers or servers or whatever. You've got hardware risk. There are political risks. Maybe somebody gets elected. Maybe the laws change, and that's also you see a legal risk. There's management risk that maybe your management will decide to not fund the project or decide that they want it done quicker or they want to decrease the budget or all kinds of things. There are technological risks, and just stop and think of all of the risks. There are risks in dealing with employees. Is the employee going to leave the company? A key employee. Is the key employee going to have a heart attack during the period? Is there going to be a pandemic during the project? Now, that's one that's going to be awful hard to plan for, but it's one to certainly consider. Um, when you have your lists, and some of these risks are good, some of them are bad. Um, Stop and ask yourself a series of questions dealing with each of the risks you've identified. Is the risk affecting a work package on the critical path? First question, because if it's not a critical path work package and the risk is going to cause it to go a little long in time, then you're not going to mess up your timeline, hopefully, unless you've got everything very very tightly regimented. Um, is the task a simple or a complex task? Because if it's a simple task, maybe you've got a vendor risk on a specific piece of hardware, but you can get that hardware from somebody else. Well, then it's a simple task. Um, are we experienced at what we are we experienced at the task? Have we done this type of task before? Or what are the outside risks dealing with each task? And do we have employee risks and the key employee kind of risks? So each of these, it's going to take a lot of time, but by identifying the risks, both good and bad, using maybe this list of samples and other samples that you'll find online, and then asking questions about each of the risks like the questions above, you'll start now and have a good idea of what your risks are in the project. Now that we've identified our risks, let's start doing a little bit of an analysis to the risk. And what I like to, and what the author of our book and others have suggested is, let's assign an estimate to the probability of each risk occurring. And the probability value is usually between 0 and 1. So let's assign a probability of an event occurring. And then let's, on a scale of 1 to 10, or I'm doing it on a scale of 0 to 1, define and estimate the potential impact of the event on the project, on this. Multiply them together to calculate a risk score, and then create a matrix, create a spreadsheet, create a document that looks something like this. And I would suggest sorting it on the score value because, I mean, let's look here. Um, I've got in my list of risks global pandemic as one of the risks, and I'm saying it's an 80% likely chance of happening. Well, since right now in 2020 we're in the middle of a global pandemic, we probably should modify that probability to a 1.0 because it's no longer a risk; it's a certainty. Um, the impact to the project is going to be, it's not going to totally impact the project because we've got a lot of remote workers, we've got a lot of teleworkers, we're IT people, we're digital, we can work from home, we can. So I'm saying it's gonna, but it's still a pretty heavy duty impact on the project. So the score of that risk would be a point 4. So it's a pretty big high score. Now, let's look at Bob. Bob here on our project is one of our key employees, and we cannot do the project without Bob. Bob is just tantamount. He's in the middle of, he's absolutely part of the project, and the project cannot continue without Bob. Well, the probability of Bob's death is, well, very low. I probably have even overestimated it because Bob's a healthy guy. But so we multiply that very low probability times the impact to the project, and his demise is here. Um, maybe one of our suppliers, maybe our money, the investments that we have to fund the remainder of the project are currently in a Dow index fund or in the stock market, and we say, well, if the Dow falls below 20,000 for any significant period of time, or falls below a certain point for any significant period of time, that's going to have some impact on the project, and you can then see that in our risk analysis. So we would create this risk analysis matrix to help us identify the probability of each risk, help us identify the impact to the project of each risk, and then by multiplying those together, we come up with a score and then sort the list by that score. So we've identified our risks, we've analyzed our risks. Now we have to come up with what are we going to do about the risks. There are negative risks and positive risks. So I want to talk about techniques for dealing with negative risks. And on the Project Plus test, you really should know these 8 responses to risk. You really should be able to identify these 8 responses to risk. And the reason there are only 7 on my list, but accept is both positive or negative. It's both a positive risk, it's a positive response to risk and a negative response to risk. So that's why I put it down here, even though the book defines it as an 8th type, the 4th type of negative, and the 4th type of positive response. So, negative responses. You can avoid the risk, just eliminate it. Avoid the risk. That's one way to do it. You don't like the risk of driving, you don't like the risk of an automobile accident. Fine, don't get in a car. We've avoided it entirely. Um, we could transfer the risk, which is to give it to a third party. Let a third party take the risk by buying insurance or performance bonds. Um, we all have automobile insurance to help um, deal with the risk of hitting somebody and the liability of that risk. So we've transferred the risk. A third thing that we can do with negative risks is we can mitigate the risk. So we can reduce the impact or reduce the probability of that impact happening. So for the negative risk of maybe getting in an automobile accident, we can reduce the impact. We can wear our seatbelts. We can reduce the probability by, well, it's raining outside or it's snowing outside. You know what? I don't think I'm going to drive today. That would be to mitigate the risk, right? By saying, and it's not avoiding it because we're not eliminating the risk. We're just reducing the probability of the risk or reducing the impact of the risk. And then lastly, for a negative risk, we can just accept it and say, c'est la vie, as the French would say. Just say, well, okay, it could happen, it could not. We'll deal with it when it does. We can just accept the risk. Now, for positive risks, we also have 4 responses. We can exploit the risk or take advantage of it. You know, this is a risk that could happen. Well, let's make it happen. Let's make it a surety. We could share the risk by using a consultant or using some type of outside resource or get outside help to make the risk, to make the probability happen so we can take advantage of it. We could even enhance the risk by monitoring all of the rest of the project and trying to make it happen. So, um, if we see, for instance, we've decided upon hardware vendor A for our networking hardware, but all of a sudden networking provider B has got their better stuff cheaper. Boom. We would exploit that advantage by switching over to that other equipment if it doesn't adversely affect the rest of our project. You can see how that would be a way to exploit or take advantage of that risk. And one of the 4th technique for dealing with positive risks is just to accept them. If they happen, they happen. If they don't, they don't. That's okay. We'll just accept it one way or the other. So the 8 ways to respond to a risk. A negative risk, we can avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept. And a positive risk, we can exploit, share, enhance, or accept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that impact matrix that we created a couple of slides ago, and I want to add 3 new columns to it. Do we have a plan to deal with that risk? Who owns the risk? Who's going to take care of the risk? Who's going to jump in and take care of this one? What department or what individual? And then what is their response to the risk? So that we've taken that original risk register and we're now building a full impact matrix to to allow us to communicate to our team members, to communicate to our stakeholders, to communicate to our sponsor, and to communicate to everyone that we've identified, we've scored, and yes, we have a plan. So, for instance, here we can see that yes, we do have a plan for a global pandemic. HR has got a work from home policy. Great. Um, there's a risk of a new PC operating system version. We think it's about a 50% risk of happening during the life of the project. What's the impact going to be? Not that big. Do we have a plan for it? Yeah, we do. Bubba Jones over there in IT has got an IT policy, and IT can handle it. Operations can handle most of that one. Um, the price of gold. Maybe we need a significant amount of gold to make something happen, or some other market risk. Um, Maybe finance would be the owner of that one because we would need budget or we would need certain other things to happen. But do we have a plan for that? No. Now we've decided to just accept it and deal with it if it happens. And then you see that losing our key employee, we do have a plan for that. Finance has bought something called Keyman Life Insurance. Keyman insurance policy, even though this isn't an insurance course, a Keyman policy or a key person policy is a policy where the business would buy a life insurance policy against an employee. That way, if a very key employee were to pass away, the life insurance company would um, pay off and would give the company money to help replace the key employee or to make up for the loss to the project. Uh, that would be transferring the risk, wouldn't it? Because we've bought insurance to transfer that risk to somebody else, an insurance company. This presentation used Kim Heldman's CompTIA Project Plus study guide as material in preparation of this video. To conclude, this project is copyright 2020 by James Reneau Ph.D. You can contact me at jreneau@shawnee.edu. Remember, this work is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution, non-commercial, share alike 4.0 international license, and I would like to say thank you for watching.